It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.
The woman who oversees the DMV, because I opened it up and I'm going, something wrong with my license? No, we want you to become a bus driver because there aren't enough of them. And, as I've been saying, the frame on this has been, there's just lazy people don't want to work, when the reality is these jobs never paid enough for people to live on. They weren't good paying jobs, and people have steered away from them. This is an opportunity for districts, for employers to step up and make these jobs better, make the conditions, the wages, hours, all of that stuff better. But it's just not bus drivers. It's, all of your support staff. It's your teachers. And what I understand is there are schools that have shut down, like taking a snow day kind of thing, because they don't have enough people to educate the children. And here to share some thoughts on that is Mark Lieberman. Mark has got a new piece out. Staff shortage affects students too. Here's where schools are shutting down. Mark is the school finance reporter at Education Week. Educationweek.org. Edweek.org is their website. Mark, thanks for taking time for us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, I get this letter, and like I said there a minute ago, I get this letter saying, we need bus drivers, desperate. We see in the news, desperately need bus drivers, got to get kids to school. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we now find out there aren't enough aides, there aren't enough cafeteria workers, there aren't people to clean the schools, there aren't teachers in front of the classrooms. We got a problem.
Yeah, we do have a problem. I mean, I think that, I, like you, found out about this, first got an inkling of this a few months ago. I was talking to a superintendent for a different story I was doing, and he mentioned to me that he was having trouble hiring enough bus drivers, and I sort of filed it away and didn't think too much of it. But, started seeing more reports and hearing from more sources about this in recent weeks. And, so, I mean, there's sort of a lot going on here. These issues with staff shortages, whether it's bus drivers, substitutes, or even teachers, are not entirely new. It's not as if up until this year, all schools have been staffed perfectly well, and now they're not. These are things that schools have been dealing with intermittently, here and there over the years, all the time. The difference is this is much more widespread than usual and much more severe than usual, according to a lot of the district leaders and school leaders that I've talked to. And as you mentioned, it's bus drivers, cafeteria workers, custodians, instructional aides, assistants, and even teachers themselves. And yes, there have been, it's a small percentage of the thousands and thousands of school districts in the country, but there has been a small percentage of schools that have had to shut down, not necessarily because they have an outbreak of COVID in the school, though that's happened as well, but because they have a certain number of teachers that are out because they've been exposed to COVID elsewhere and have to quarantine, and there aren't enough substitutes to fill those teaching positions, or there aren't enough bus drivers to get all the kids to school who normally would need a bus to get to school. And so those schools have had to essentially shift back to what they were doing in kind of March through May of 2020, sort of full-time remote learning,
right,
for a couple days, even a week. And beyond that, for the people who are working in school buildings that are not shutting down, there's sort of a convergence of a lot of factors here. As you mentioned, many of these jobs historically have not paid particularly well, have not offered an assurance of long-term employment, have not offered robust benefits, and have offered at times an unpleasant or challenging work environment. Working with students, working with families.
Working with children. That to me is the way. Nope, no thanks.
Right. Well, and I mean, obviously there are rewards to that as well, but there is a lot put on people in these positions, and particularly when the compensation or the reward is not there, it can be difficult to continue. You add on top of that, many of the people who were in those positions, are retired teachers or older people, maybe people using these positions for supplemental income, and maybe have decided they don't need to go back and do that work anymore, or they want to go back, but the risk of contracting the the virus is too high,
Right.
and they're sort of
So you
they're
think
losing
COVID
weight for
is
that reason.
COVID the driver of this? Do you think, or do you think, as I do, in a lot of this is we've been squeezing education budgets for decades. We've been starving, especially poorer school districts, for decades. Because I got to tell you, I don't think there are too many schools in Bucks County or Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, where they're paying upwards of $20,000 per student. I don't think you're getting too much of the shortages there. I got to think the shutdowns are happening in places where they were struggling years ago, and this is just now the next manifestation of their problems.
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think that every person I talk to, I made a point to ask, is this more severe than you've ever experienced before, or is this just people paying more attention than usual? And all of them have said, yes, this is far more severe than usual, and we do believe the pandemic has made it worse. And sort of on the flip side of that, if there were no pandemic, it wouldn't be as bad. On the other hand, I think that you're making a good point that the fact that there were these vulnerabilities in school staffing to begin with, particularly in rural areas that historically have struggled to find enough people. For example, like special education assistants, people who work with students with disabilities. The federal government has been reporting shortages of people in those qualified people in those positions in every state in the country for a decade, perhaps even more. In many cases, I think I saw a report that in many cases those jobs end up being filled by people who are not actually qualified for them, just to get people in. And you're seeing that happen in other contexts as well right now, where schools are so desperate for people that they're looking outside the traditional sets of qualifications just to kind of fill this sort of emergency need. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a confluence of factors. I mean, one of the things that prompted me to write the story in the first place was there was a lot of political rhetoric about the role that unemployment benefits were playing in this. That the idea that people were choosing to stay home and not work because they were getting more money from the unemployment benefits than they were getting from what they would be getting working. And so far there's been very little evidence that that argument really
Yeah, it's
holds water.
nonsense. It was nonsense when they were making the argument, and I think the people like Lindsey Graham who were making it knew it was nonsense. I think what we're seeing right now is you're seeing all across this country, you're seeing unionized workers taking to the picket line because they're tired of the poor wages, the horrible working conditions. They're tired of it, and they're doing what they can do to fight back. But in the private sector where people don't have unions, the vast majority of people, they're marching on a picket line. It's just they're not protected, and they're doing what they're doing by marching out the door and not coming back. So for me, and I go back to economics class from a gazillion years ago, if you have a shortage, you have to increase something. Something's got to get better. There've got to be more sweeteners, better wages, better benefits, something to entice people to come back. Because I don't think we have a people shortage. I just think we have a people shortage willing to take crappy jobs. Just my thought.
No, yeah, and I mean, for example, I talked to a superintendent or a principal, actually, school principal in North Carolina, who was telling me that they're hiring for custodians in their school building, and they've had numerous candidates come to them and say, look, I can get paid $7 more per hour at Chick-fil-A down the street than I can working here. And they're basically asking, what's my incentive to take a job here? And consequently, I mean, many school districts have, at least temporarily, substantially increased wages for some of these jobs in an effort to get people in the door. A lot of schools are using some portion of the federal relief money that they got from the 3 sets of congressional aid during the pandemic. To offer recruitment incentives, $1,000 signing bonus, things of that nature.
Yeah, and you've got governors calling out the National Guard to drive buses.
Yes, in at least one state, the National Guard is pitching in. I mean, I guess the thing that I want to bring this back to is, in reporting on this, on these issues, it can sometimes get a little bit academic. Talking about staff shortages and you have this many positions that aren't filled. But I think the kind of crucial thing I always want to emphasize is all of these shortages and all of this chaos really has a direct effect on the students. We've heard about teachers who are sacrificing their planning periods to cover for another teacher who's out. Obviously, we've heard about these schools that are shutting down. We've heard about, I talked to a person who sort of works in a instructional aid capacity, talking about she had to cover for a class, and so she couldn't provide the kind of one-on-one aid that some of her assigned students typically get. We've heard about students having to get students with disabilities who require sort of specialized attention, having to get sent home and have their services made up later because there aren't enough people to kind of give them that one-on-one attention.
Right.
In terms of the shortage of cafeteria workers, there have been a couple of isolated cases where like students have gone hungry during the school day because the food just didn't arrive. Far more cases where menus are more limited, where for buses, students having to crowd into buses because there are fewer driving. Students getting to school an hour or two late because the buses are having to cover so much more territory with the few people they have. And all of these things are really throwing a wrench into what was supposed to be a, in an ideal world, what would have been a kind of return to some sense of normalcy in the kind of K-12 landscape. Most schools have ostensibly reopened their doors for full-time in-person instruction after a year and a half of quite a bit of disruption caused by the virus. And in addition to the resurgence of the virus that was perhaps unexpected a few months ago, we're also seeing that despite all of the efforts to kind of bring the K-12 schooling back to some semblance of normalcy and to provide students with an opportunity to, whether it's make up for the time that they lost or the experiences that they lost, or just sort of reacclimate to a world that is very different than the one that they were experiencing last time they were in school in person.
Yeah, the last time they remember being in school. You're right. You're listening to the Rick Smith Show here with Mark Lieberman. He's school finance reporter at Education Week. You can check out their website, edweek.org. We'll get links out on social media. He's got a new piece out on staff shortages and how it affects students. One of my concerns is while all of this stuff's going on, Mark, while you had the last year and a half of the whatever we want to call that period of Zoom learning, now you've got all of this disruption because we can't staff things properly. I fear massive burnout for teachers. And then we've got a crisis next year and the year after. And this becomes a structural thing that takes, a decade or more to fix out. But in that process, I worry, do they catch up? Because I think right now they're behind where they should be. And I think a lot of parents share this fear. So when you're talking to these principals and these superintendents and these folks, what kind of sense do you get from them? How stunted will our kids be, if that's the right word? How much will they be behind? Or do they anticipate by the end of the journey most people being where they're supposed to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not an expert on the sort of phenomenon of learning loss, which there's kind of a debate really about the extent to which that term is even the appropriate way of thinking about what students are experiencing. But undeniably, yes, students' learning experiences have been disrupted in any number of ways, to varying degrees. Not all students had an equally disrupted experience. To the first part of your question, yes, the sort of teacher burnout phenomenon, which several of my colleagues have written about quite well as well, and I recommend people check out their coverage, is certainly accelerating. All the people I talked to for this story, many of them confessed to me, I don't know how much longer I can go on in the public school environment, given the level of chaos. So much is expected of them, and right now so much more than usual because they're getting additional responsibilities on top of their already demanding workload, and that of course has an effect on the students. I do think I think that the full scope of the problem in terms of students, whether it's their diminished learning experience or kind of academic achievements, has yet to be fully understood. There's been evidence trickling out that test scores have gone down, but yes, also keep in mind, it's hard to know what to expect students to have accomplished given this sort of escalating circumstances that we've been dealing with since March of 2020. And so I think it sort of demands a rethinking of what constitutes learning achievements. Ideally we'll also, renew the focus on ensuring that students are provided with the resources in schools to get the help they need, whether there's a crisis or not. For example, the last thing I'll say, a lot of schools were not prepared to do remote learning in March 2020 because there hadn't been enough investment in the technology that they would need to make that transition prior to COVID. And one would hope that a crisis like this would prompt some introspection about how to ensure that those things are on the right track before a crisis like this comes up. So.
No, it's something we need. So as you're talking to these folks, because obviously for your reporting, you've talked to principals and superintendents and all the people who were in the know. What would make it easier to attract people? What's their plan on addressing these, especially in the classroom, when you're not having teachers in the front of it or aides to help kids who have special needs? The cafeteria stuff. I mean, we could have people bring bag lunches or do something along that line and figure that out. But getting them to school, making sure there's a qualified teacher at the front and an aide, those things, that seems kind of like the minimum. How are they planning to address that?
Well, it's a daunting challenge. I mean, I think there's not one playbook for how to fix the problem. I mean, I think that obviously increased wages, increased benefits is part of that, and a layer on top of that is ensuring that funding for schools is adequate to offer those benefits. I also think part of the pitch always is that there's an intrinsic value to participating in the process of educating students and providing valuable experiences for kids. But as you say, I mean, that's not that's sort of an emotional appeal that without the kind of grounding of something more concrete, I think it can be lacking. I will say, I also just think efforts to contain the pandemic are really crucial to this. I mean, it sounds basic, but there is some portion of the staffing shortage problem that can be attributed to people's reluctance to return to school buildings, either because they're vulnerable or because their school building is no longer requiring masks and they feel that they should be. And so I think there's a safety element to this that sort of can't be ignored. But yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of principals and superintendents are sort of trying to find out the answers to the questions you're asking as well, and the people who find the answers are going to be highly sought after, I think.
No, I appreciate the report. I appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Good stuff, Mark. Mark Lieberman, school finance reporter at Education Week, edweek.org, the website. You can check out his piece on how staff shortages are affecting students. Thanks so much, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Good stuff. Love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break, right back after this. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. For working people on the talk.
And the union gives a voice to win on The Rick Smith Show.